In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Hitler's last gamble ignited. But what awaited his armies wasn't just fire and steel, it was science. This is the untold story of the secret fuse that changed the fate of World War II. Welcome to Bloodstained Chronicles, where forgotten wars come back to life. December 16th, 1944, the forests of the Ardennes lay frozen under a blanket of snow, silent and unsuspecting as the last desperate gamble of Adolf Hitler was about to unfold. This was the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II, a battle that would decide not only the fate of the Western Front, but the very shape of modern warfare. Hitler called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. His goal was simple yet audacious: to break through the Allied lines, split the British and American armies, seize the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace that could save the collapsing Third Reich. But what he didn't know was that on the other side of the frozen front, the Allies possessed a secret weapon so advanced, so revolutionary, that it would change the mathematics of war forever. A weapon so small it could fit in the palm of a hand, yet powerful enough to turn the sky itself into a killer. It was called the proximity fuse. Inside an ordinary-looking artillery shell, American science had hidden a tiny radar brain, a fuse that could sense its target and decide for itself when to explode. In the snow-clad silence of the Ardennes, this secret would transform the battlefield and turn Hitler's last gamble into his army's graveyard. By the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was cornered. In the east, the Red Army was crushing German divisions as it pushed toward Berlin. In the west, after the Allied invasion of Normandy, France had been liberated, Paris was free, and German forces were falling back toward their homeland. Hitler refused to accept defeat. Against the advice of many of his generals, he crafted a final counterstroke, a surprise winter offensive through the dense Ardennes forest, where the Allies least expected an attack. The plan relied on secrecy, deception, and the element of shock. Over 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks including the mighty Tiger and Panther, and 2,000 artillery pieces were quietly assembled under the cover of fog and forest. American intelligence completely missed the build-up. They believed the Ardennes sector was quiet, a place for resting divisions, not a battlefield. Many of the U.S. soldiers stationed there were young replacements, barely trained, alongside exhausted veterans sent to recuperate from earlier battles. They had no idea that the greatest German offensive since 1940 was about to smash into them. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the silence shattered. The German artillery opened fire across an 85-mile front. The forest shook as 16,000 shells per minute rained down on American positions. Communication lines were cut, command posts obliterated, entire units vanished in the chaos. Then came the tanks, dark shapes emerging through the mist, their engines growling as they pushed westward. The surprise was total, the shock overwhelming. The American front bent but didn't break. Amidst the confusion, isolated pockets of resistance began to form, small units that refused to retreat. These were men who fought with courage, but soon something else would join the fight, a weapon unlike any the world had seen before. Until this moment, artillery had always been predictable. Shells exploded when they hit the ground or after a timed delay. Soldiers had learned to survive by digging deep, by sheltering behind trees, in trenches, or under layers of earth. The rules of survival were clear. If you stayed low, if you hid from the blast, you lived. But on that frozen morning, those rules would die. The weapon that changed everything looked ordinary. A 105mm artillery shell, grey and unremarkable. Yet inside its tip was the product of one of the most secret and advanced scientific efforts of World War II, a device so closely guarded that its classification rivaled even that of the atomic bomb. The proximity fuse, or VT fuse as it was codenamed, contained a miniature radar system, a transmitter and receiver small enough to fit inside the shell's nose. As the shell soared through the air, it emitted radio waves that bounced off the ground, trees, or even soldiers. When the returning signal reached a certain strength, the fuse instantly triggered detonation. For the first time in history, an artillery shell could think for itself. It no longer needed to hit the ground to kill. It could explode in mid-air at the precise height where its fragments would inflict maximum destruction. The result was terrifyingly efficient. A single shell, bursting 30 feet above the ground, could kill as many soldiers as 10 shells that struck the earth. Behind this breakthrough stood America's brightest minds. The project began in 1940 at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory under the leadership of Dr. Merle Tuve. Working in secrecy, his team faced impossible challenges. A fuse had to survive being fired from a cannon, a force of 20,000 times gravity, temperatures above 3,000 degrees, and the violent spin of flight. Ordinary electronics would shatter instantly. So the scientists invented miniature vacuum tubes the size of pencil erasers, designed glass ampules that shattered under acceleration to create tiny batteries, and used shock-absorbing materials to keep the circuitry intact. The level of precision was staggering. Factories across America, RCA, General Electric, Sylvania, Crosley, converted entire production lines to build the new fuse. Radios, refrigerators, and peacetime goods were replaced by war work. Over 100 companies and more than 20,000 workers, many of them women, spent endless hours assembling and testing every component. Each fuse was inspected, numbered, and tested. There could be no errors. By late 1944, American industry was producing 40,000 proximity fuses a day, yet the weapon remained a secret, used only in anti-aircraft fire to protect that secret from falling into enemy hands. On the ground, strict orders forbade its use. That changed when Colonel Oscar A. Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group in the Ardennes, faced a desperate situation. His forward cavalry squadron was being overrun. Conventional shells were failing to stop the German advance. Knowing he risked court-martial, Axelson broke orders. He ordered his gunners to load the new proximity fuse shells. The results were instantaneous and devastating. The German soldiers advancing through the snow suddenly found death descending from the sky. The shells no longer buried themselves harmlessly in the ground. They burst above their heads, shredding everything below. Foxholes offered no protection, trenches became traps. The veterans of the Eastern Front, who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, now faced a new kind of warfare they could not comprehend. Survivors spoke later of shells that had eyes, of air that turned to steel. Reports of the weapon's success spread quickly. Within days, General Eisenhower lifted the restrictions. By December 21st, every artillery unit in the Ardennes was authorized to use proximity-fused shells. What followed was a storm of fire unlike anything in military history. At Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held the line against Hitler's elite 6th SS Panzer Army. Over 3 days, 160,000 shells fell. Only a quarter were proximity fused, but they caused over half of all German casualties. The slopes of the ridge became killing fields. Entire SS companies vanished in seconds, their assaults broken before they could even reach the American lines. Further south, at Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded and outnumbered, holding a vital crossroads. When the Germans demanded surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied, "Nuts!" The battle that followed was hellish. Wave after wave of German attacks crashed against American lines. But the defenders had something new, artillery armed with proximity fuses. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, composed of African-American gunners, whose heroism was long overlooked, unleashed a curtain of steel that tore the attackers apart. The shells exploded above the fields, raining death downward. The snow turned red, and the German offensive broke against invisible fire. Even the skies bore witness. On January 1st, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack with nearly 900 fighters striking Allied airfields in a final attempt to regain air superiority. The attack inflicted heavy damage, but as the German planes turned home, Allied anti-aircraft batteries were waiting. Their shells, now equipped with proximity fuses, no longer guessed the altitude of their targets. They detonated automatically when close enough, creating perfect walls of exploding steel. That day, the Luftwaffe lost 277 aircraft, 172 to anti-aircraft fire alone. The German Air Force never recovered. By the time the snow began to melt in early 1945, the German offensive was shattered. What Hitler had called his last gamble had failed catastrophically. The Allies suffered 75,000 casualties, but the Germans lost nearly 100,000, many to artillery that now ruled the sky. The proximity fuse had not just multiplied the killing power of Allied guns. It had changed the psychology of war. German soldiers no longer trusted their trenches or forests. They called the new shells death from above. They spoke of forests that exploded, of rivers that became graveyards. At the Sauer River, one of the most chilling demonstrations occurred. German troops tried to cross the frozen waters under cover of darkness. The Americans opened fire with proximity-fused shells. The explosions lit up the night sky. When the barrage ended, over 700 German bodies lay scattered on the ice. General George S. Patton witnessed the aftermath and later wrote, "The funny fuses won the Battle of the Bulge for us." Historians agree that this single innovation may have shortened the war in Europe by months and saved tens of thousands of lives. Field Marshal von Rundstedt himself admitted after the war that the proximity fuse was decisive, saying, "Our attacks broke down not because of American courage alone, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." Studies after the battle showed that though proximity shells made up only 25% of the artillery fired, they caused over 60% of German casualties. The weapon's effectiveness was 5 to 10 times greater than that of conventional shells. Yet beyond the battlefield, the legacy of the proximity fuse reached even further. The same precision manufacturing that produced 22 million fuses during the war became the foundation of post-war electronics. The miniaturization of vacuum tubes led to early computers, satellites, and eventually space exploration. Dr. James Van Allen, who worked on the Fuse program, later used similar technology to discover Earth's radiation belts. The coordination of more than 100 companies became the blueprint for America's Cold War industrial base. And the very idea of machines making decisions in fractions of a second, detonating at the perfect moment without human input, paved the way for guided missiles, radar-controlled bombs, and modern smart weapons. The proximity fuse was the ancestor of all of them. In human terms, its story was one of contrasts, of ingenuity and horror. In American factories, young women soldered fragile circuits through the night, never told what they were building, only that it mattered. On the frozen fields of Belgium, young German soldiers, many of them boys, died under skies that betrayed them. They died in trenches, in forests, in rivers, never understanding how the air itself had turned against them. For them, it was not technology but terror. For the Allies, it was salvation through science. When the guns finally fell silent in late January 1945, the Ardennes lay in ruins. Hitler's dream of dividing the Allies had ended in ashes. His last gamble had become his army's grave. The battle cost nearly 200,000 lives on both sides, but without the proximity fuse, the price could have been far higher. In that frozen forest, in that desperate winter, something profound had changed: warfare itself. The proximity fuse had proven that brains could matter more than brawn, that science could be as decisive as courage, and that the balance of power on the battlefield could shift with a single spark of innovation. From that winter forward, every soldier who looked up at the sky carried a new fear, that the air itself could kill. The proximity fuse had rewritten the rules of survival, marking the dawn of a new era, the age of technological warfare. The weapon that once hid inside an artillery shell would evolve into radar-guided missiles, precision bombs and autonomous systems, all descendants of that tiny brain that learned how to think for itself. The Battle of the Bulge stands today as both a story of valor and a warning of progress, a moment when the courage of men met the brilliance of science. Hitler's last gamble was undone not just by bravery, but by innovation. The forests of the Ardennes became a proving ground for the future, a place where the past died and the modern battlefield was born. This was the battle where the skies turned deadly, where technology tipped the scales of history, and where a secret weapon no larger than a coffee can help end the war that engulfed the world. This was the Battle of the Bulge, the day when science, steel, and sacrifice collided, and from that collision rose the age of modern warfare. The Battle of the Bulge ended in silence, but its legacy still burns. Out of that frozen forest rose the dawn of modern warfare. This is Bloodstained Chronicles. Hit subscribe and join us where history still bleeds through time.